Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our public event this evening to discuss the reducing the impact of flooding in Naburn as part of our work in York. So welcome, everyone. I'll just introduce you to the team we've got here this evening. So myself, Marilyn Sanderson, one of the advisors working in the York flood risk team, but Kathy Stevenson and Dan Wilkinson, both flood risk advisors within the team. And with us also, we've got Edward Dickinson and Emily Collins behind the scenes, who are going to be facilitating and providing the engagement for us this evening to help the meeting run as smoothly as possible. Okay. So structure of the meeting is being recorded, and that's so that anybody who couldn't make it, or if you want to rewatch any part of it that you might have missed this evening, then that will be made available to yourselves on YouTube, so you can watch it in your own time. We're hoping to keep the presentation a bit shorter than 40 minutes. It'll probably be somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes. To allow maximum time for your questions, which is what we're here for this evening. So you can submit questions, as some of you have already, thank you very much for that, on the Slido. So if you've got another device or another browser open on your laptops or computers, whatever you're using, and you go to Slido and type in the event code, which is hashtag NaburnC3. And hopefully Emily put that in the chat function for you now, so you'll be able to click on it from there. So our aim is to be fair and inclusive. So we will prioritise questions from yourselves that have been upvoted. So if you see a question in there that you would also like the answer to, or if your question has already been asked, please click on the little thumbs up button, which will push that to the top of the list. And then as we get to, if we're running out of time towards the end, we will be prioritising those questions that have got the most thumbs up attributed to them. And then after the event, we will be circulating a summary of tonight, and we will be putting on there those questions that we did answer and any that we weren't able to. And we're hoping to get that out to you in the new year. Okay. Excellent. So hopefully, if you've got your slide open, it'll ask you now to how did you find out about this event? So there's two functions. This just to make sure that the slide is working, you're able to get in there, but also it helps us to know how or if we are reaching out to yourselves and how it is that you're getting hold of our information. Excellent, quite a few of you getting emails and the flood group itself, so that's great. Cool. Just tell me when you're ready to move on, Ed. Oh.
Give another 10 seconds and then we'll move on.
Super, thank you. I forgot to mention, we've also got Steve Ragg with us, who is the City of York Council Flood Risk Manager, who's going to help us this evening. So if there are any questions that are directed towards the Council, Steve's kindly joining us and will be able to answer some of those questions.
I'm going to move the slides on now, Marilyn.
Thank you. So the overview this evening, we're going to look at your input into this presentation. We're going to give a summary of our processes to help give a better understanding of how we reach our decisions. And then we're going to dive straight into Naburn, the history of our work in Naburn, the challenges that we've come across, and an introduction into property flood resilience, and then what are our current and next steps. And then we'll be opening the floor up to your questions. So we'll allow plenty of time for that. Okay, so we sent a survey out about a month ago, and we asked a series of questions, mainly what it was that you wanted to know and what did you feel that you knew least about. So we could prioritise our presentation to hopefully answer as much of those questions as we can through the presentation itself. So clearly the bias on these questions, so we're looking towards answering questions on PFR, what's included in the PFR scheme and what's not included, and then where does the responsibility for maintenance of your measures lie once they have been installed. We've also got eligibility for PFR. So there's slides covering those questions. Obviously, any questions that you don't feel are being addressed, then please just pop them into the slider and we'll get to them as well. So our priorities, we go to the next, what you asked us to prioritise. So top of the list there, we've got why Naburn is not getting a large scale scheme. And as I already mentioned, we're going to be going through some of the challenges that we've got in Naburn and why, unfortunately, we are unable to deliver a scheme here. The impact on roads and access, also of a high priority. And again, on the what is it that PFR can do for you. So like I say, we have got some slides on these, but anything you don't feel is being addressed, please just pop the questions in the insider. So straight into our process then. So I've summarised it here into, we've just got the 4 sort of key steps here, which is simplifying it a little bit, but it's just to give a broad understanding. So it starts with the options appraisal reports. So there's been a series of these in Naburn. Pop to the next slide. So the process of this, we have our specialists, so we apply contractors and it's ACOM who've designed these reports for us. And the purpose of the report is to give detailed assessment of the means by which floodwater enters properties. So is it coming from the river? Is it coming up through the drains? Is it coming from any tributaries that are going into the main river? And what options are best to try and manage those flood mechanisms. So a number of possible options are usually identified, and these are covering a wide range of possible options, and these are shortlisted so we can appraise them further. Now, significantly, one of those appraisals is the economic assessment, and this is something that's completely out of our hands. All the options are costed and assessed against the cost of the benefits that they bring. And as we've got, the financial cost of any defence across England must outweigh the financial cost of flood damages. So those flood damages is the benefits that the defence itself would be providing. And we must adhere to government spending rules where the benefit cost ratio must be more than 1. So those benefits, so those damages that it protects, must be more than what it costs to put the defence in the first place. Otherwise, we're unable to spend the government money. Okay. Well, those options are all screened and to look at what is possible or unlikely to be pulled forward. And as I said, we looked at a myriad of options going from floodgates, barriers, walls and embankments. Then we've got raising of walls or gates across the slipway and property flood resilience itself. Okay. Now, key considerations for every option, obviously, it must reduce the risk of flooding, otherwise it's not a flood risk option. But we also have to make sure that it is technically viable to be able to be constructible. It's economic, as I've just mentioned, it has to be cheaper than the flood damages. Is it socially acceptable? And does it have any adverse effect on the environment or any heritage? And then can it be delivered safely? So that's the key constraints that we have to adhere to for any option taken forward. Okay, so I'm going to pass you on to Kathy now, who's going to give a bit more detail on our work in Naburn and how we've sort of reached the decisions that we've got so far.
Thank you, Marilyn. So I'm just going to take us through some of the assessment activities that have gone on in Naburn, going back to the 2000 options appraisal report over the last 20 years. So there have been a wide range of assessments and options, and none of them have been able to indicate an economically viable engineered scheme for Naburn. Naburn. The appraisal process was revisited following the flooding in 2012, and then again in 2016 when Naburn was looked at as one of the flood cells making up the York 5-year plan, which is now developed obviously into the York Flood Alleviation Scheme. So that was the funding that came out from central government following the 2015 flooding, which impacted across the country. So looking at that most recent set of appraisals that have been done from sort of 2016 onwards, we've looked at a variety of measures that could, in some form of combination, provide Naburn with a flood protection. The things that we have considered include, as Marilyn alluded to, the use of flood walls and gates at a range of locations, road raising, pumping systems, and provision of pens stock and flapped out falls at the benefit cost calculation seesaw. The assessment process also works to maximise the benefits we can claim to balance those costs. And obviously the aim of that is to reach that all-important benefit cost ratio number of something greater than 1. I'll go in more detail into the challenges of calculating those costs and benefits and getting them to balance in Naburn, but I'd like to first touch on the subject of impact of the wider York scheme to areas like Naburn, where we've been unable to provide a heavy engineered scheme. So as part of the York Flood Alleviation Scheme as a whole, we have commissioned modelling work to check any risk of increase of flood risk as works are completed elsewhere in the city. So this was initially done in 2018, was revised again in 2019. The analysis looks at the risk today and also any predicted risk in the future climate change scenarios. So those are increases to 2039 and looking into the longer future of 2117. The analysis has showed the maximum water level increase in Naburn is 17 millimetres, so that's just over 1.5 centimetres in the current day scenario, and up to nearly 2.5 millimetres in the future climate change scenario. That has shown that there are no additional properties put at risk as a result of the work in any of the other cells in York, those that are under construction at the moment or are planned to be constructed over the next couple of years. So moving on to the challenges that we have looked at when we're going through that appraisal process. These are listed as the linear nature of the required defences, and that's to do with the shape of Bishopthorpe and its proximity to the river, the multiple flood sources, the tributary we have coming in of Howden Dyke, field drainage that drains through the village, and the surface water system. Howden Dyke itself, the proximity of any structures to the village itself, which increases visual impact, and the complexity of installing the necessary underground workings that are required under defences, and the attendant limited space to work in. So I take those in order. The linear nature of Naburn. So this slide illustrates one of the scheme proposals that was considered in one of the myriad of assessments that's been done. So any single asset has the potential to be outflanked and end up increasing flood risk. This is a significant challenge in Naburn, as I think you might be able to see from the slide. You can get floodwater ending up being trapped behind a defence if the defence line has not been constructed and considered appropriately with the same level of defence across the whole length. Any chain, of course, is only as strong as its weakest link. So any options that we progress need to show that all significant flood sources are either dealt with by the scheme or can be mitigated by additional arrangements, for example, temporary pumping. You can see that the slide shows considerations over 5 different sections or reaches, and each reach illustrates a potential flood flow into the village. So as you can see from that slide, we are looking at potentially over 600 metres of defence line, which is quite a considerable length and therefore cost, considering the relatively small number of properties that are protected, which obviously represents the benefit side of the slide. Sorry, Ed, can we go forward now? Thank you. So looking at the various sources of flooding, as I mentioned before, any flood scheme must look to address all significant flooding. So in Naburn, as well as the primary challenge of the River Ouse itself, we have the route that the Ouse can take through Howden Dyke into the village. There is the flow in Howden Dyke itself, which needs to be addressed. The impact of any localised rainfall in the area on the local surface water system, and any field drainage which feeds into those systems as well from the areas to the east. You will also notice that there is a significant area within the centre of the village where the low-lying nature of the land shows that there is an increased risk there of surface water getting onto the surface, settling and pooling. And I think anyone who lives in the village is quite familiar with that particular problem there. So looking at Howden Dyke and the challenge that poses with regard to overpumping, permanent pumping arrangements are prohibitively expensive. Permanent pumping stations cost upwards of £1 million to put in place, and then have ongoing challenges with replacement, maintenance and operation, all of which have to be factored in to the whole of life costs of a scheme. Temporary pumping arrangements are also expensive and resource intensive. And when we are in an emergency response mode in York, the provision of any pump cannot actually be assured at any time. So moving on to visual impact. So this is something that we do need to take into account, the impact on the natural and the human environment of anything that we wish to see. In Naburn, the proximity of our interventions, our measures, our structures to the village itself, to individual private properties, and the challenge of those structures significantly changing the nature of the centre of the village, the views out onto the river, onto the washlands on the other side of the river. That risk is actually quite high. So there's a risk of blocking access to the river for residents, as I think this drawing, which gives a potential impact in just one of the many reaches that we're considering. So the visual impact and the access impacts to the river for residents. So when river levels are up, water pressure obviously is increased, and that can cause seepage underneath the flood walls. So a little bit like an iceberg, any flood wall protection that you might see around York will have considerable work underground to ensure that that seepage is cut off. These are most often provided by sheet piling, which is driven underneath flood walls, or sometimes we use grouting underground to again cut off any seepage coming through, which would undermine the protection line, the defence line, if you like. Another challenge linked to that, but not exclusively to do with our underground working, is the limited space to work. In order to provide a traditional flood wall cut-off right at the river's edge, the size of the river, the size of the flood wall would have to be much higher than further away. But in either case, we would have limited working. And it would most likely that for some of the reaches, that work would have to be done from the river itself. And the costs and the risk to the delivery of the project in the long run, because of the risk of flooding when you're working from the river, again, all adds to the cost side of the equation and undermines our ability to hit that magic cost-benefit ratio of 1. We are obviously aware that the impact on access roads. However, government spending rules for flood risk schemes is very heavily weighted for the benefits of protecting homes against flooding, those damages avoided. So there are limited benefits available for protecting or improving access. So it is quite challenging to justify schemes where there are costs involved that really are based mainly on improved access. So having gone through those challenges that have been taken into account and had to be taken into account as part of the assessment process, despite our best efforts over a number of years, we have been unable to find a capital scheme that is affordable by some considerable margin. We are, however, committed to provide what flood protection we can to all those at risk, and therefore the solution that we have for Naburn is the Property Flood Resilience Scheme. So I will hand back to Marilyn now, who will take you through what PFR, as the acronym is, can mean for Naburn.
Lovely, thank you, Cathy. So PFR stands for Property Flood Resilience, and it is a bespoke set of measures to better protect individual homes and businesses from flooding. Now, every property is unique, the fabric of the building and the way in which floodwater can enter the building. And as such, we would be doing individual property surveys, that's fine, sorry, individual property surveys for each building to assess what measures would be more suitable and what measures would actually be advantageous for that particular building. So the York scheme, we're offering to install £7,500 worth of resistance measures to those properties that are eligible. Now, resistance measures covers flood barriers and doors, automatic air brakes, non-return valves, which go in the wastewater pipes, repointing of brickwork or waterproof treatment to exterior walls, and sealing of service entry points. This isn't an exhaustive list. Your service entry points are the pipes and cables that go through the exterior wall of your properties. In addition to these measures that stop water coming in, we do install pumps. So from earlier pilot schemes across the UK, the PFR has found that actually installing a pump is the best way to manage and mitigate any seepage that can sort of overcome the barriers and the doors that we've got, or any groundwater or subfloor flooding. There's two types of pumps. There's a puddle pump, which is a portable pump that you would just put where it is needed, and these are generally used for hard flooring, so if you've got a concrete floor, or a permanently installed sump pump, which is for if you've got suspended timber flooring, and that would go in your subfloor void to pump out any of the groundwater or any seepage that gets under the floor. And a complete package of protection measures is necessary for maximum effectiveness. So we would be looking at the property as a whole and offering protection for the entire property, i.e. not leaving a gap or a route for water to be able to get in. So normally included, these are some of the examples. So you've got a door in picture A and a barrier in picture B. So it's either or, although at least one entry point to your property must be protected by a barrier, so that if you are surrounded by floodwater, you are at least still able to get in and out without breaking that protection that you've got. We've got the automatic air bricks, which look just like ordinary air bricks, but they've got the function inside to prevent floodwater from getting into your cavity walls. And then the black circle with the square next to it, so the pump, it's a sump pump. So essentially it's installed in a chamber in the subfloor void, and then be an outlet pipe which will extract that water that gets in there. And these can be internal if needs be, if that's the best place for them. Most likely and most popular is to put them outside your property with a pipe that goes into that subfloor, so it pumps the water out and then it's extracted away from your property. What we're not including, or what is normally included in PFR, so gardens, garages, outbuildings are typically excluded from the scheme unless there is a direct flow route from that, for example, an adjoining garage. If there's no way protecting the property without encompassing the garage itself, then we would look at best ways of doing that. But otherwise, the garage wouldn't ordinarily be eligible for measures. Floodgates, again, is because ordinarily floodgates are protecting gardens. They are not normally included unless there are extenuating circumstances or homeowners are wishing to pay for them themselves, essentially. And resilience measures. So examples of resilience measures are where you can, you could raise electrics or put hard flooring in. Concrete floors are more resilient to flooding than your timber flooring. These are not included in our scheme, and typically these sort of measures would be in excess of £30,000 per property to enable us to protect as many properties as possible. Our scheme is very limited to resistance only. So, eligibility then. So homes and businesses that are at risk of flooding from the main river. So in case of Naburn, the River Ouse, and in addition, any properties that have flooded in the past whilst the river was in flood. So this includes properties that were flooded potentially as a direct result of a Howden Dyke, for example, or surface water being backed up because the river is in flood. So if you're flooded at the time when the river was in flood itself, then you're eligible for PFR. Or if your property has an adjoining wall or is part of a terrace to an eligible property. So if your property is slightly higher or slightly outside the flood outline, but you've got a adjoining wall, then you yourself are also then eligible for PFR. Okay, what we need from yourselves. So it's very important that you sign up to the free flood warning service if you haven't already done so. I would recommend it anyway, and I'm sure a lot of you do have it. But if you're going to accept the scheme and have PFR measures, then we need to know that you know when to deploy the measures and importantly when to be able to take them down again afterwards. And it was the homeowner responsibilities to store and maintain those measures once they have been installed and handed over. So I'm going to pass you over to Dan, who's going to tell you where we are now and what the next steps are for yourselves.
Brilliant, thanks Marilyn. So what are the next steps? First, it's useful to understand what PFR is, and it's a structured 10-step process. I'm not going to go into the details around each of these individual steps at this time, because we plan to share a number of detailed documents with you in the new year. But here's an overview of the stages in the process. We're currently at step 2, which is community engagement and contacting you as homeowners. The steps are linear in nature and can only be progressed once the preceding step has been completed. Some steps can take much longer than others due to individual circumstances, but overall the process should take around 9 months. Next step up. So properties within the flood outline will be sent a questionnaire to complete. This will help us understand any individual property flood history and aid our consultancy partners. Once you've returned your questionnaire, we will arrange for our consultancy partner to come and survey your property. And this is to ascertain which PFR measures are most suitable. A detailed report of findings will then be provided to the EA and you as homeowners. We will then arrange to discuss the content of the report and offer a drop-in session so you can see some of the products in person. Slide. So this also relates to the interest that you had around having a look at the PFR product demonstrations. So what we'll do is we'll look to provide a local event as part of the step forward plan. Although this does depend on the latest guidance regarding COVID-19 and venues being available. More information on this again will follow in the new year. Then what we need from you is engagement. So please continue to engage with us, read through the materials we share and respond to any requests within the timeframes that are given. This helps minimise any potential delays. Your patience and understanding will be greatly appreciated as well. Please be patient. PFR has a lot of moving parts, and there are limits to how many properties we can work on at any one time. There are about 400 properties in the York area that are likely to qualify for PFR, and all with a unique set of challenges. And yeah, that concludes where we are at the moment, and I'll pass back over to Ed for the question part of the session.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thank you to everyone who presented, nicely under that 40-minute threshold that we were targeting. So I'm going to moderate the question and answer session that we have. See that we've already had 12 or so questions added to Slido. Feel free to add any more as we're going on. I appreciate that sometimes people dive out before the Q&A session. I don't take it personally, don't worry. But what we would ask is we're going to share a feedback link. So it's a very short survey. It's only 3 questions in the chat box. So if anyone is leaving, if you did have a minute to fill in that survey, we'd really appreciate it. That just helps us improve our public events as we go on. We're getting semi-experienced on it now, but you know, we could always value additional feedback. What I'm going to do, Marilyn referred to this at the start of the event, is prioritize those questions that have been asked that have the most thumbs up. So you'll see, I don't know if you can see my mouse on the screen, but each question that's submitted on Slido, there's the option to kind of upvote it. I'll prioritize those. However, if we're in a situation where one person is asking a lot of the questions, what I'll do is try and prioritize other questions just to make sure that everyone who's attending has a chance to ask a question. If in the event that we don't cover all the questions in the event, we will address them in the summary document that we circulate afterwards. So what we'll do, probably in the new year, given where we are in terms of December, is to provide a link to the event on YouTube, which you can share with anyone who wasn't able to attend. We will provide a summary of this event, and it's kind of a type up of the questions that have been asked, and also provide a more detailed document on the information on PFR. And if you have any questions that you don't feel are addressed here, and we appreciate there's a limit to how many words you can put in a question, feel free to email us at the York Flood Plan email account. So to start off with, we have a question from John Stanley, which is, in 2000, just over 50 houses, or 1 in 3, were flooded. If the river flooded to the top of the design height of the defences, how many houses would be flooded? I'm going to direct that to Kathy, please.
Hi, thank you, Ed. So the flood height in 2000 was about 8.8, 8.9 metres AOD. So if we were looking to design to the 1 in 100, which is the level we designed to, we were trying to develop a scheme for a minimum of a 9 metre height. That would indicate closer to 60 properties flooded. So that would be the increase. Obviously, overtopping or failure of a flood defence brings with it its own challenges as well. But I think those are the figures. I can double check those and confirm those though, if you want to after the event.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Now I'll just tick that. This is kind of a live question and a question sheet, so sometimes things can move around. So if for whatever reason I suddenly miss something, or don't stick to my golden rules, then please have patience. But we'll try and track it as best as possible. The next question is from David Moores. Just highlight that. So properties flood from water backing up to the surface water drains from Howden Dyke. What can be done to the drainage system that would alleviate this problem? I'm going to direct this question to Steve Raggett, City of York Council.
Thanks, Edward. Yes, I've spoken to Laurie Gunson from the flood group on this, and it's something that we've committed to take forward separately to the discussions that are happening here today and as the wider flood scheme. There has been some work done before in Palms Court and Close, isn't it, in the past. And we are dependent on the capacity and the operation of the Yorkshire Water Pumping Station as well. Where possible, we will look for localised solutions and work with the flood group in trying to take those forward. But I think, as Kathy outlined in her presentation, it's the interaction with the ooze as significant input into the Howden Dyke network that really backs the surface water system up in terms of flooding. And without an exclusion of the ooze waters from the surface water system in and around Howden Dyke and other parts of this village, it's very difficult to get a holistic scheme together to actually prevent some of these things happening. But we will work with the flood group and look for any localized solutions that could be effective.
Thanks very much, Steve. I'll just take that question. The next question to highlight is anonymous, and it says, when will the EA contact the residents to discuss the individual PFR measures with householders, and why has the threshold been set at 7,500 per household? And I'll direct that question to Marilyn, please.
Hi, thanks, Ed. So 7,500 is the allocation that we've got for York, which is actually better than in other areas across the UK. And part of that is from the funding that we received in 2015 and how we were able to provide that little bit extra funding for properties in York. So contact residents to discuss individual measures. Once you've had your survey, we will be inviting you to discuss with ourselves the content of that survey, and we will be able to see what options there are that you can have choice over. So some things come in different colours, or like say with the doors and the barriers, you can opt to have doors as long as you've got a barrier, but the way you put that barrier is your choice. You can have it at the front or the back, or whichever door is best suited. So we will be inviting you to have those discussions with ourselves, with our contractors, once those surveys have been completed.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Let's take that. And highlight the next question. How much of the original York FAS funding remains unspent, and how do the EA prioritise which areas of the city to protect? If I could direct that question to Kathy, please.
Thanks, Ed. So there is no specific allocation of funds to any one flood cell in the York FAS. A flood cell is defined by an area that where the flood risk in that area can be addressed independently from the areas around it. So each cell goes through the assessment process that we've described earlier in the presentation, and it is going through that process of identifying an option that will technically work, and that the costs of which can be balanced against the benefits. That is what determines where we can spend the money in any one location, and it is not any upfront allocation of funds.
Okay. Many thanks, Kathy. Next question is from Anonymous. Do your surveys for eligibility for property protection take AOD threshold levels into account? How can residents find out their own threshold level? I'll direct that to Marilyn, please.
So yes, we do take thresholds as above ordnance datum. However, when we look for eligible properties, it's those properties that fit inside the 1 in 100 flood outline. So those properties that would flood in a 1 in 100 event, whose thresholds fall under that. So they are lower than the flood height expected in that flood. Once we've done the surveys, then we are going to be applying contractors to measure the threshold levels in Naburn. Unless the data we have is still valid, then we will use that data to ascertain your threshold. But importantly, when we send the questionnaire out, it's entirely down to the homeowners to let us know how and when they flooded. If you don't have that information, it's not important, in that we will fill in the gaps. So if you're new to the area or you don't have the history, then we can fill in some of those gaps for you. But if there's a flood event that's happened that you know of, please give as much information as you can.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Next question from Anonymous. These general increases in water levels are very interesting, but has any consideration been given to the frequency of flooding going forward? And I'll direct that to Kathy, please.
Thank you, Ed. We talk about the frequency of flooding. We used to talk about a 1 in 100 year flood, etc., etc. We tend to talk about probability now. And when something becomes more frequent, the probability obviously changes. So sometimes it's better to look at the actual level that we're designing for. So under the York scheme, we have modelled, and as I said, in Naburn, the 1 in 100 year event is looking at about 9 metres AOD above ordnance datum. But when we are calculating what that size of flood, what level that will reach, we look at what it will reach today and what that probability would reach in the future, taking into account climate change. With regard to looking at lower frequency events underneath the 1 in 100 or 1% probability event, we have looked at some lower frequency events when we've been doing the analysis for the scheme. However, the smaller the flood, the fewer benefits there are, and the costs don't come down that much. So which is why under the York FAS, our standard protection we are hitting is the 1%, the 1 in 100 event. And that's why the assessments process is focused very much on that 1 in 100 year event. And going forward, as Marilyn has just said, that is the benchmark we set.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Just take that question. Next question is from John Jefferson. I note that gardens are not covered unless there are implications for the property. Please explain what that means. I'll direct that to Marilyn, please.
Yeah, sorry if I wasn't entirely clear. So gardens are not covered. Properties that have adjoining garages, for example, so garages are not included in the scheme. However, if we can't protect the house without putting measures on the garage, then that's where there's a direct implication of floodwater to get through the garage and into your house as such. Where a property might have a garden wall, which might provide some flood protection, there are ways in which we can potentially put a barrier or a gate in the wall. However, there are implications on the homeowner in this instance, where we would need a structural survey of the wall to be done, and the cost of the gate itself would have to be met by the homeowner. So we can only cover costs of measures to the main property itself, but we are willing to provide advice, or we can provide advice. And if you do wish to have measures put in your garden walls, then we're able to include that during the work, but the cost of the measure itself would have to be met by the homeowner.
Many thanks, Marilyn. Next question. This one's from Charlotte. How many houses in Naburn have you budgeted to receive the PFR? And I'll send that back to you, Marilyn.
Thanks. So we've done an estimate based on the flood outline of around 50 properties. However, that will be assessed properly when we send out the questionnaires to yourselves. So the questionnaires will go to all those properties, and if you feel that you are you're just within the outline, or you haven't flooded in the past, and this is the information that we need from yourselves, and we will add you into our list should we need to. Or if you're within the outline but your property is quite high, your thresholds are quite high, and as such the PFR measures won't achieve anything for yourself, then we would look at that and we would have discussions with yourselves.
Thank you. I'll just tick that. Next question is from Anonymous. The costs for flood protection might not come down if frequency increases, however, cost to residents goes up. Does that not help the figures balance? And if I could send that to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Ed. I think that the cost per property that continues to be, so a property that's right next to the river and floods on a very frequent basis. Obviously, the costs, yes, do increase if it's happening once every 5 years, once every 2 years, rather than once every 50 years. However, that is countered by the number of properties that you lose, the reduction in the sheer number of households. So you may have 50 properties, which now goes down, and I'm picking these figures out the air, but you're now looking at 10 properties, and 10 properties that flood more often does not counter the 40 properties you've lost on the benefit side of things. That's a very crude way of putting it, but that is taken into account. But I'm afraid it doesn't provide.
Sorry, I don't know if it just cut out there for anyone else. Yeah, sorry, Kathy, could you say the last bit again, please?
Oh, I was just saying that unfortunately, the reduction in the number of properties has a much larger impact than you would think, and it doesn't provide the frequency of those properties that are left to flood in a more frequent event does not balance that out, unfortunately.
Okay, many thanks. Next question is from Anna. Just highlight it. What strategies are the EA adopting in the Ouse catchment area to reduce the amount of water that impacts downstream during flood events? Thankfully, we had some good news in the last week or two about the FOSS storage area, which is part of that solution. But if I send that back to Kathy, please.
Thanks, Ed. So, Flood Alleviation Scheme in York is to maintain the 1% annual exceedance probability, that 1 in 100 level of protection into the future. However, in order to maintain that level of protection, Mother Nature will keep moving the goalposts. So the actual height, physical height of the wall will have to keep going up in order to keep that same probability protection, if you like, standard of protection, we call it. So one of the ways, as the person who's asked this question, as Anna is pointing towards, is to look at the other end of it, try and control the speed and the amount of water that comes down towards us in York. Now, as part of York FAS, we have projected into the future that in order to maintain that standard of protection in the future, we do have plans in place and strategies being developed to address managing water in those upper catchments, in the 3 taps as they are, the Swale, the Ure, the Nid, the Vale of York, those catchments that actually supply the water that whistles towards us in York when we have a flood impact. Those can be large storage areas Ed just alluded, the great news we've had recently, that the flood storage area, which is the FOSS storage area, which is looking to do that on the FOSS catchment, that hopefully in future might be able to be repeated on the other catchments above us. But there are also a lot of other innovations, things like natural flood management, tree planting, land management in the upper catchments, that are strategies that are being employed across the board to manage that water upstream where it's coming from.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Next question is from Anonymous. How is the economic viability assessed? I wish I could give you a break, Kathy, but I'll have to come back to you on this one as well.
Okay. The simple answer is the Treasury Green Book. So that is government treasury rules of balancing costs and benefits in any public infrastructure scheme, whether it's HS2, whether it's a flood wall in York. There are other government guidelines now. The multicoloured manual, I think, is the main one that we use in flood risk management, which has details in there about literally how much you can value a house that floods this often in damages avoided, and it goes through, so it's quite prescriptive, which I think, you know, Marilyn has alluded to right from the beginning, that we have quite a prescriptive process we need to go through to assess how we put a monetary value on a benefit. And costs, obviously they are taken into account, construction costs, design costs, but we also have to bear in mind whole of life costs that will include maintenance for the lifetime of the flood wall, floodgate. If it's a floodgate, it will need to be replaced at some point in the future. That needs to be costed in now. So as a kind of a brief overview of the two sides of the jigsaw, the two sides of the seesaw, and how we the rules that we follow to do that. That's a very brief overview, but I hope that gives a direction for the questioner.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Next question, I'll just highlight it, is what is the life expectancy for the measures and who is responsible for the replacement costs in the future? And I assume this is referring to PFR measures, so I'll direct this question to Marilyn, please.
Super, thanks. So some of the measures, depending on how frequently they've got floodwater in them, essentially, may need replacing more often than others. Often when it comes to replacing measures, it's certain elements of them. For example, the first thing typically to go would be the rubber seals. So if they have been subject to multiple floodings, then you might find you'll have to replace the seals more often than else. Typically, measures last, so for your barriers, your doors, normally they're given 10 to 15 years. However, the better they're looked after, the more maintenance they get, then the longer they're likely to still give you that level of protection. And responsibility for that is the homeowner. Most of the measures will have a 12-month warranty, so that'll be a manufacturer's warranty. But once that warranty has expired, then the cost of any replacements or maintenance comes down to the homeowner.
Great, many thanks, Marilyn. I have another question lined up for you, which is from Anonymous. When will residents hear from the EEA that they are eligible for PFR?
So we're currently getting contractors in place to carry out the surveys, and then obviously the installation works within Naburn. We're anticipating to get everything lined up in the new year, and we're hopeful to be able to get surveys done spring next year. Now, we will be getting in touch with you prior to that with our questionnaires. So we'll be sending those out again early in the next year. We'll be sending the questionnaires to yourselves so you can start thinking about what your flood mechanisms are. So,
many thanks, Marilyn. And One question I'm not sure is best for yourself or Kathy, but I'll start with Marilyn and Kathy can add to it, is from Anonymous. If 50 properties flooded in 2000 and you think up to 60 could flood in future, how will you decide which 10 or so properties qualify under the eligibility?
So sorry, thank you, Ed. The flood outline for where the 50 to 60 properties comes from. So in 2000, the flood event essentially was categorized at the time of around about a 1 in 80 flooding event. We are protecting, or our flood outline that we are protecting properties within is the 1 in 100, which is a bigger flood than York has ever seen. So those extra 60 properties, if you like, are within that flood outline. So it's not about us picking 10 properties. It's all those properties within the flood outline become eligible for PFR if the thresholds are under that level to which floodwater would reach.
Great, many thanks, Marilyn. Next question. I'm just going to delete this one. It was something that we set up just to help, get people in the mood for submitting questions. I'll just take that York flood plan one. Next question is from Tim Rain. Why is the fosse not dredged to increase water volume within, serving the same purpose as the floodplain, allowing boats to use the fosse navigation once again? What we'd say is that a question regarding to dredging, it's important but not necessarily relevant to this presentation. So what we would do is, in the case of Tim Rain, we have had some correspondence on this separately, but if anyone has any other questions, that's something that we're happy to have a discussion with separate to this meeting. So just to tick that one off. Next question is from Phil Dance. Mr. Dance, I know what this question relates to, so Mr. Dance did email us previously, so this is partially relating to the limitations that we have and how long a question you can submit on Slido. We do that so to ensure that everyone has an equal chance of submitting a question, otherwise you could end up with quite important but lengthy questions which might crowd out other people. So on this one, we are in the process of sending a response to Mr. Dance to his email that he sent earlier today. Next question is from Anonymous. Why can't there be an adequate floodgate installed at the riverside of the slipway, thus allowing non-return valve sited at the top of the slipway to work? And if I could direct that to Kathy, please.
Thank you, Ed. A floodgate installed at the base of the slipway on the riverside would have to be considerably higher than the closer to the river you get, because the land tends to fall away. Any defence, whether it's a flood wall or whether it's a floodgate, gets higher and higher the closer you get to the river. It would not, obviously, any surface water behind it would then have to be overpumped. And all of the previous challenges that we have discussed about having to install piling underneath, having to ensure that seepage doesn't occur, that the installation and then the operation of the gate, those all, whether you put it on the halfway up the slipway, at the top of the slipway, or at the bottom, they all occur. They all mean the same thing.
Great, many thanks, Kathy. Next question is from John Jefferson. When you say 50 properties flooded, how do you define a property? Is it the physical house or the boundaries of the whole property? For example, the part of a garden. If I could send that back to you, Kathy, please.
It is the physical building, the home. So when we talk about a residential property, it is the physical building. We have master mapping, it's called, which is a layer which gives us the outline of each boundary. And if a flood outline cuts through that, the property is said to flood. If it cuts through the garden but doesn't touch the building, it is not deemed as counted as a flooded property in that respect.
Many thanks, Kathy. And a final question from Anonymous. Most residents don't know how much they are at risk. Flooding isn't related to proximity to the river. will you let each resident know how much risk they are under? I will direct that question to Marilyn, please, but allow for anyone else to add to that afterwards.
So we'll be getting in touch with those residents that are eligible for PFR. For anybody else, if you want to know what your flood risk is, then there is the government website, which, if I can ask Emily to put the address to it in the chat function, and it's what is my flood risk, which you can put your postcode in and that'll give you what flood risk your property is at. And you're right, it's not just about proximity to the river, because it'll give you flood risk from surface water, from coastal, obviously not relevant for Naburn, but if you've got properties elsewhere, you might want to put postcodes in.
Many thanks. And the final question is, if none of the PFR measures available through the scheme resolve and or reduce the flood impact to a property, what other options are available? And if I could direct that back to you, please, Marilyn.
Please write again if I'm not answering your question, because I'm reading this as so if what we can provide you isn't relevant in terms of the resistance measures, then there are other things you can do within a property, which are the resilience, so the more expensive, more intrusive options. However, if you are at flood risk and the resistance measures don't provide enough protection, then we would recommend that the resilience route is something that you look to go down. And this can be tiled flooring instead of laminate downstairs, raised electrics. There's various options with regard to where you put your plasterboards on sideways rather than upright, so that if you do get flood water in, then the amount of plasterboard that has to be replaced because of flood damage is significantly less, because you don't have to replace a whole board essentially. There are various things, so kitchen cupboards and things that are not sitting on the floor itself, so you've got your valuables and your goods are raised off the floor. And various, like where you've got carpet going up the stairs, it's a tread, so a central tread that you can then roll up the first few steps. So where water does get into a property, the damage is absolutely minimal and it can be cleaned out, made hygienic, and then you've got your house back a lot quicker than if you're having to replace flooring and replace carpet and furniture and the like.
Thank you very much.
Is that what the question was? I'm not sure if I've answered the question or not. So if the person can get back in touch or send us an email, and we'll do what we can.
Yeah, we're always available at York Flood Plan at environment-agency.gov.uk, and we'll try our best to get back to you as soon as possible. I'll just tick that question. So that's the end of the question and answer session. So it really is just to say, to reiterate that we'll be sharing a recording of this event early in the new year, a summary of the event, so we'll type up the answers that we gave. If there's any items where we said we'll have to come back to, then obviously we'll add that detail in the summary. And we'll also look to include an attachment which provides more detail on PFR, so that includes detail on those 10 steps that Dan outlined, but also frequently asked questions, so that we hopefully can address more of questions that come up. In the meantime, if you do have any questions about Naburn, the decision that was made, or PFR, please do get in touch at York Flood Plan at environment-agency.gov.uk. Bit of a mouthful. It should be in the chat as well. And we do have our York Flood Alleviation Scheme website. If you type it into Google, you'll be able to find it and get updates. And we do encourage people to enjoy we hope they enjoy, but also sign up to, I don't know why I said enjoy, sign up to our electronic mailing list where we provide updates. So thank you very much to everyone who's kind of taken the time from their evenings to attend. Want to extend a special thanks to Laurie Gunston, who's done a great job in helping us kind of get people to attend and find out about the work that we're doing. So that's really appreciated. Yes, I hope everyone has a lovely evening and a lovely Christmas break if we're not in correspondence with you.